I think Abby covered a lot, and I know we're a little bit behind. I appreciate everyone's patience both here and joining us virtually, so I don't spend too much time here. But I'm Carrie Beck. I'm the director of the Life Science Venture Program, which is a program under the Life Science Tennessee Foundation. So we work with startups across the state of Tennessee in the life sciences, so drug development, medical devices, diagnostics, and the like. Just provide mentorship, structure, programming, and really help them gain traction towards commercialization and provide whatever resources we can. And part of that program is our monthly education series, which is what we're doing today. And I'm joined by Rick Gaykowski. I hope I pronounced that right, Rick. Perfect. Perfect. Who is the head of regulatory science and quality management with the tech development and industry engagement department over at St. Jude, as well as Jen Hoglin, who is the head of and engagement also with the tech development and industry engagement department at St. Jude. So they are here to talk to us today about regulatory, but a little bit different lens than I think what most people tend to focus on, and that is and strategy and considering regulatory factors early on in product development and kind of a holistic view. So don't want to steal too much thunder, and I'll pass it over to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. We are part of a new department within St. Jude. This technology development and industry engagement started about a year and a half ago, and we took into underneath our wing is what was known as the Office of Technology Licensing. So we have a broad range of new people. Actually, all of us are new in the department, and it came from our strategic plan of having how do we take our go from ideation to licensing and really support our science and get it so that we can magnify our accessibility of all the great things that are happening at St. Jude. So that's where Rick and I are now. But we are going to have a nice disclaimer. We just want to let you know that this is based on our experience and our years of working in product development and life sciences. We have pretty robust. We're going to be fast in our presentation and our conversation together with you, just so that we can get some time for Q&A. As Carrie said, it's going to be a little bit more of a conversation. We knew we were in a smaller group and we didn't know what dynamic it was going to be. Thankfully, we're not in a huge auditorium. But what we'd really like to do is we'll play it more to a conversation. So if I interrupt Rick, which I tend to do often, don't think I'm being rude. It's all planned. And so we can add just because I can't my mouth, that is pretty much what it is. And then likewise, we're not talking, we're going to have a back and forth. So if you want to jump in, please jump in, or if you want to save your questions to the end, we have time for that as well. And then at that point, I'll let Rick introduce.
So good afternoon, everyone, and maybe more importantly, happy Veterans Day. Any veterans in the room? Incredible. I come from a military family, even though I myself have never had that opportunity. I'm sort of at that age where I didn't even have to register for the draft, which is one of the great benefits of, I think, you know, my life. But I certainly respect and appreciate everyone who has. Happy Veterans Day. I'm Rick Gaykowski. I've been at St. Jude for about 1 year now, getting close to my first anniversary. I've been about 35 years or so out in industry, principally with small startups, mid-caps, as well as Fortune 100 companies over my career. Done everything from artificial heart technologies to regenerative medicine and drugs. So today we want to cover sort of a broad range. I'm really grateful to be here and to share maybe a little bit of my experience with you and to share the stage with Jen. So,
thanks, Rick. I'm Jen Hoglin. My background is all marketing. I really love to work in new product development and downstream marketing. So from ideation to sustainability, I've had the opportunity to do market research, voice of customer around the world, focused on with 3M and companies like 3M, Edwards Life Sciences, and most recently with Myriad Genetics, which is a molecular diagnostic laboratory that was spun out of University of Utah about 40 years ago. And most people who are not in that space know it because it was a company that brought the BRCA1, BRCA2 testing to the market. And so it's an LDT, not regulated officially by FDA, but the standards still hold the same. My current role as marketing engagement really focused on that ideation and how you integrate marketing into, and the other functions, as I call them, the peripherals, into the space of new product development.
So some of the materials that we want to cover today, I think are going to be broad, but then in some instances, maybe a little bit more specific. So I think most of you know, Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act has been around for about almost 90 years in this country. It started in 1938 as a result of the thalidomide challenges that were faced at that time. The regulations, as we pretty much know them now, have really come into force about 1976. But there have been some modifications in those in 1990 and 2016. But the benefit and the reality of that is that there is a structure in place. And that structure is pretty broad and all-encompassing. It covers foods, drugs, biologics, devices, radiation-emitting products, human cell tissue products, HCTPs, which is really kind of a nuanced area, but also cosmetics. So today we want to talk a little bit about more of the healthcare side of things. I always find it interesting that in the cosmetics world, the regulations are identified in the same embodiment that we have with surgical devices, in vitro diagnostics, as well as drugs. It's not regulated quite the same way, but the documentation requirements that exist, even in that area of the law, continues to be applied and is consistent. Within FDA, within the main healthcare sector, there's probably 3 or 4 main areas that really provide a notable regulation. So the Center of Biologics is really kind of an upcoming branch within FDA. There's been a lot of emphasis with CBER that it has been emphasized by FDA. They specifically will look at biologics products, which also includes the Office of Technology, or what is referred to as OTAP. Probably the big giant in the room is the Center for Drugs and Evaluation. It's probably the largest and probably the most sophisticated. Many of the practices that CDER applies are very well known and certainly are complied with by all players within that industry. Probably the second largest division or branch within FDA is devices, and that includes in vitro diagnostic devices. Over the past 5, 7, 10 years, there's been a lot more emphasis placed on combination products. So when I mention combination products, think about something that could be in maybe 2 worlds. So think about a filled syringe that is provided out for use. There's a device, a syringe, but also a pharmaceutical or a drug. And so that is a really foundational example of a combination product. As Jen mentioned, there's another area I think that has really been discussed and debated a lot over the past number of years, which is laboratory developed tests, or LDTs. We've sort of been off and on, hot and cold in that particular area with the amount of regulatory oversight. There's a lot of similarities and differences that exist between these branches of FDA. Certainly patient safety and compliance is very consistent and steady across all of the branches. Also, how they may react with combination products. In the example of a drug-filled syringe, even though there's a device component, which CDRH would be involved in all likelihood, the branch there is going to be the drug branch of FDA, because that's really the primary delivery system or mode of action that really is going to have an impact on the patient. Another example of that might be drug-eluting stents. In that particular case, the Center of Devices and Radiological Health historically has been the lead branch as compared to the drug branch of FDA in drug-eluting stent technologies. But there's also some differences between some of these branches as well. And part of those differences rely specifically in the areas of guidance documents. CDRH is probably one of the more active branches consistently in issuing guidance documents. It takes a village to raise a child or raise a family. It takes a lot of attention to keep up on guidance documents. And that really started quite a bit during the Obama administration, has really continued pretty prolifically within CDRH. A lot of the guidance documents are in the drug branch. They have remained fairly consistent over the years, with the exception of biologics, the Center of Biologics coming out with a lot of new technologies, cell and gene therapy. There's a fair amount of movement that we see there. There are some timeline differences which also occur within those various branches for product approvals. In a real foundational manner, the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act really breaks products generally into about 3 different areas. Categories largely are based or predicated upon risk. So Class 1 products typically are not affiliated with a lot of regulatory submission requirements. In some cases, they do have submission requirements, but typically most submission requirements are in Class 2 and Class 3 areas. It's interesting that when we look to our neighbors to the north in Canada, they actually have a 4th classification, which is a Class 4, and so it's really a hybrid of Class 3 and Class 4 products. And then there's some differences also when we look across the globe. In the European Union, there's a slightly different category classification system where there's a Class 1, 2A, 2B, and then also a Class 3 type of device or product breakdown. The main point being, all regulatory bodies typically apply a risk-based approach to their classification and how they look at various technologies. So not only is FDA a primary regulatory body that operates, there are also similar regulatory bodies that operate in most major countries and most major markets. If there isn't an official mirror image of FDA in a given country, the Ministry of Health will typically become very involved in what's going on within that particular country. But some examples might be MHRA in the UK, for example, MHLW in Japan, NMPA in China. There's also regulatory bodies, of course, within India. Australia has a leading regulatory body in PGA, and then also ANVISA, for example, in Brazil, and COFEPRIS in Mexico. These particular entities across the globe generally model themselves after the US FDA approach. And simply because it's recognized as one of the leading and the best regulatory entities that are really out there. And so there's a lot of lead and following that occurs within the industry. Another element that is important, I think, for small business representatives or owners or participants to realize is if one ever gets into a situation of a product recall or a matter like that, there is incredible communication between all of these regulatory agencies that occurs, and it occurs quickly and swiftly. And so if one is conducting a recall, for example, in the US, and you have international products within your organization or your business, that word gets around very quickly, and that kind of information is shared. So that's something to really be aware of and careful of. Jim?
Which makes me think that I had the privilege, I think you can say, of experiencing the consent decree in one of my manufacturing jobs. And we had to respond really quickly to all of the different European or the OUS or outside the United States bodies. And they also have their own requirements for recall. So they definitely talk to each other and very quickly. I lived through that for quite a long time. I would say it was a great learning moment because I like to talk about it and reflect on it. When we talked a little bit about new product development, but I brought this up because most people know these stages. Everyone has a different definition of them, but I wanted to bring this up in a way that we would get operational definitions. So we'd all have an understanding when I said ideation, feasibility. And when you think about these in typical new product development, be it a device or anything, there's phase gates that help you pass along. Every company has a different way of doing it, but for the most part, you have to meet your guidelines to move on. And when you think about who is the drivers of these different phases, in a traditional way, technology development or R&D takes you all the way from ideation to development. And particularly in a startup mindset where you are bootstrapping, if you will, or you're not thinking about how you have limited resources, those are the ways that you're really relying on the R&D side. And then but when sometimes you'll see that when you hit that development phase, that's when you start bringing IP, which you can also say legal, but I like to think of it as an IP thing. And then occasionally you'll see the manufacturing regulatory. Now, obviously, this is very, very blanket. Your experiences might be a little bit different than the person sitting next to you's experience. But for the most part, when you think about ideation to commercialization, this is what you'll see. Then you start to, as you get closer up to that launch, you bring in regulatory for sure. It's how do you manufacture, how do you scale it up to bring to market. And then you may start to have discussions about sales, marketing, and finance and quality may be a part of it. Hopefully they are, but not all the time, except for when everyone thinks of launch. So marketing in the traditional fashion, I work at St. Jude, and when I've only worked there for 6 months, everyone asks me if I do the commercials, and I don't even touch the commercials. So I'm not even on that side of the marketing side. And when I happened to meet the CFO this last week of GE Healthcare. And when I said I worked at St. Jude, he goes, oh, I hope no, not that marketing, the other side of marketing. And so this is when you think about marketing, when it's in the, what's my promotional strategy? How am I going to get my little one pager? What's our website going to look like? How are we going to bring this in? Messaging, pitch decks, etc. And then, of course, you have the other functions. And then when it comes to, you may at this time bring clinical affairs if it's appropriate, but interestingly enough, when you get into the commercialization and sustainability side, then we now have core groups that you always seem to have on a regular thing. And this is also when you think about commercialization, and of course sustainability is how do you keep your product in the market. You have a very linear mindset. So having the opportunity, I think, and the privilege of growing up at 3M. I worked at 3M with the dental division that just had won the Baldrige Award. This was a long time ago, before gray hair and glasses. So we were really introduced to a new way of integrating new product development, and that's what this is here. Really thinking of a different way of new product development and having this in your ideation that's when you actually bring in your regulatory, your intellectual property and finance. And the interesting part of this and why it's a shift for many people is because the roles are so maybe minor, but they become support roles. And the regulatory is key. And this is why I was regulatory regulating once so well, is because of the fact that he really understands the value of regulatory at that ideation phase and its partnership with marketing and its partnership with tech dev or R&D. And what that is I know what claims the market needs. The R&D team is going to hopefully get the data to prove those claims, and my regulatory partner is going to say that's going to meet the guidelines of the CBER or the package that we're going to put to the FDA. And we're doing that at ideation so that as we go into feasibility and development, we are already understanding how our package is going to look when we submit it into the CE mark or the FDA. And that's why this cross-functional concept has been successful throughout the world, and hopefully in your space too. But it is a new mindset for some, particularly in the startup space, because of limited resources. It continues on in this feasibility. Sometimes clinical affairs comes into the feasibility side of your in this phase, and that's because they're the ones who have the relationships with the KOLs. And so that's when they're going to be going out having those conversations with KOLs, key opinion leaders or key influencers, to start to have that conversation of, here's what we're thinking, would this be, not only are you feasibility from a conceptual standpoint, but how does it fit into your practice? We had this when I was at 3M Dental many decades ago, and we actually had a beta testing point. We built it into our new product development process to have beta testing, because key influencers are so huge in the dental space that if you didn't have them in feasibility and integrate them into your new product development process when you got to launch, they actually would work against you. And then we learned that. So as I was doing my black belt project for Six Sigma into this ideation phase, how do you then bring them in? And because their influence in the market was so critical to having a successful product launch. And then in this side, where now that you're in development, you're getting that data, you're working with your patents, you're making sure that the data that you're getting is going to strengthen your patent portfolio, and not just that one-time patent, but your whole patent strategy. You're thinking of your manufacturing process, where you're starting to say, do you need sterilization? How do you get, what's your supply chain look like? Where are you going to manufacture if it's not in your capacity? Scale up becomes a very interesting part, because that's when you start bringing sales or business development. You're now at that. We had a beta testing portion of scale up when for certain KOLs in this particular example, we had to tell them, you're using the product, it's in scale up, it's been approved by the FDA. Any opinion you have, that's awesome. We'll record it and we will launch the product. And then when we're in our commercialization and sustainability, so notice tech dev comes back, R&D comes back, because we're going to put it in for our line extensions. So it becomes, although the new product development process is very linear, it actually is extremely circular. Where you start to think of that upstream, although it seems counterintuitive because the upstream is actually going downstream. But if the upstream side of your product development is ideation into scale up, and then you overlap with it in that downstream side, I'm launching sustainability, thinking about those functions from this page and saying, how do I integrate them into that circular mindset and circular process? That's when you start to see line extensions. How do I expand if I'm going to be launching in the US first, and then I want to go outside the United States, Europe, probably then Japan are the most common ones. How do you then bring that into the ideation and going into that extension? All of that is that strategy up front, because if we're planning on launching in the US and Europe, I need to have my regulatory teammate there so that they will help us think differently and plan for that expansion in a different way than if I get to my launch and all of a sudden I'm like, well, I want to launch in Europe too, because I talked to this guy, this doctor, she was really awesome at this conference, she's super interested in us, and then it's too late. We're already launching, and now that window of opportunity and that window of competitive market might have been lost too, because I didn't talk to my IP attorneys and I didn't get my IP side of it. And so I have IP in the US, but I don't have IP outside the United States. So that's why this concept, everything is a connection, and how I call it the power of the peripherals. Because in most times I've happily 35 years with an engineer, and he always says, what is marketing? It's just a bunch of hand waving and, it's just a little fluffy stuff. Because the focus in most of all of the companies where I've worked is engineering or R&D is the source and the core energy of how we get revenue. And so the power of the peripherals is what really helps us launch at the start, where you start to see things like there's a market assessments. You see, I put in there the key influencers of strategic involvement, but also at the same time, you have that supply chain and distribution management. How are you going to do the supply chain? How are you going to get your product out the door? And then, of course, what I love the most is the second to the bottom, which is that novel technology versus me too and line extensions. Are you entering the market with the mindset that you're going to change the basis of competition? Or are you entering the market with, we're going to have a me too? This is our strategy. We're going to have a me too, so we have a footprint in the marketplace, and then we'll have quick speed to market, and we'll do an evolution to our product fast, so that we then already have our next line extension coming out within a year or two, depending on the regulatory process. But all of these things are part of the strategic plan and how you build your product portfolio. And then, of course, it impacts on how you're interested in investors, and how you start to how the voice customer plays in, and how you're going to have an impact on patient care and your treatment plans. So the power of the peripherals is strong, and of course I'm very biased as I'm sitting here with one of the peripherals. But it is something that, as you think about your different stages of new product development, it really has that, it emphasizes the power, the reasoning for the integration of all functions from the start.
Some of the best organizations that I've ever worked with, and there's one in particular that was just incredible. We had a very interesting concept about teams, even to the extreme, where they made sure that every team representative, irrespective of the department within that company that they worked, sat together, they met together, they ate together. They took it to the extreme. What I learned from that process was, when teams function at a high level, you can do some incredible things. This was an organization that launched 13 to 15 new projects a year. I mean, think about that. That's something new coming out every 3 to 5 weeks, either a new product or a line extension or new and improved. Most organizations that I've been with, and I've been with a few over my career, have not really been able to perform at that level. And I always am taken back to the point of, how did that happen? How could that occur? It was because of the team. And even though some of these areas are new, when a team was emphasized, and not only just a team, but a high-performing team, business leaders had a very good idea of a couple of things. Number one, what are all of the tangible assets that we have as an organization, and what is their priority level? What are my greatest assets? What kind of teams do I have? I want to make sure that I assign my best performing teams to my greatest assets for the greatest amount of protection. Because I know that that is what survivability and growth and enhancement is all about. I think when that kind of an approach and that sort of a philosophy is engaged in and engendered, it really brings a lot of benefit and help, which may not be understood when it's not initially engaged in. Another thing that is really helpful with high performance teams is it helps to transition between academics and research, and shift a little bit more into a development kind of a mindset. I'll mention this a little bit later, but there's a significant difference in the industry between research, quote unquote, and development. Research is not officially or formally regulated in the same way that development is. And that is a very important distinction. I think that new business owners or business leaders need to be very, very clear about. And so it's really about the quality is integrated universally in functional activities. And so when individual people are strong contributors to an overall team, some really great and important things can happen. Here are some benefits that I just identified in integrating regulatory affairs early in the process. It deals with strategy. It deals with ability to tactically execute. I'm not sure about all of you in the room, but I can say pretty clearly that every project that I have worked on over the years, I don't know that any one of it has gone perfectly. There pretty much is always some adjustment or some pivoting that occurs. And so when all of the functions are involved early, one can bring team members together. If strategies need to be altered, refined, adjusted, that can be done. If your claims, for example, of a product need to be modified because of the data that one is getting through your testing and your development assessments with your R&D experts, you can do that, and you can do it early as compared to later at the end and have some major surprises, which really that really put you or could put you in a difficult position. And not only that, I think that early engagement and involvement with a variety of team members allows one to have a very good sense of what kind of indications and product claims can I really make. I've been at some organizations where once a product was released, we were pretty much fat and happy, if you will, in just being able to market and to sell. And we didn't necessarily always keep our finger on the pulse of what was going on out in industry. And we, at some point, wanted to reapproach the FDA about expanding our claims. FDA had some very interesting opinions about our ability to do that. And we felt pretty confident in being able to say, you know, we have all of this information. Again, they had a little bit different view about that because they were aware of information that was not necessarily always aligned with ours. And so we were, in this particular situation, we were one of the first companies that was allowed to do a de novo submission without a clinical trial. And what we found was that the information which we believed was to our advantage was not quite as strong as what we thought. And so as we did some level 1 and level 2 statistical analysis on available data, we realized that we actually should not be saying some of the things about our product that we actually were. And so we had to back off a little bit and move into a more appropriate area to maintain our commitment to compliance, which we always have. But it was a fact-based assessment to give us the boundaries of really where we needed to operate and how we could go out and talk about our products or the lack thereof.
So I just want to bring us back to the filled syringe example that Rick had, and this is where any one of these books. So we've always, in a lot of my kits that we've had, I've put together for my new product developments and the product launches, you've always added filled syringes or any type of thing to do ease of use for the customer. And so we would map out, we would work with manufacturing to put together our kits and have a place for that filled syringe so that it was, you know, it was going to be okay and it was not going to fall, it wasn't going to break, it was plastic, but it would, you know, just wasn't going to leak. Well, what was the importance of having regulatory involved in that was it wasn't just the fact that we need to make sure we had filled syringe, but we also had to do testing on shipments. So we had to do all of our logistics and supply chain had to be involved in our manufacturing because we had to meet the requirements from the FDA to prove out that our syringe wasn't going to change with any type of temperatures, et cetera. So because we were putting the kit together with the customer in mind, And we had we wanted them to have early adoption and ease of adoption. And we were creating this kit. It actually was a great benefit to having our regulatory partner as part of that cross-functional team, so that we could then plan for it. And it wasn't at the end, like Rick said, where all of a sudden we have a syringe, like what? We can't launch now. We're really upsetting the top C-suite because we're holding back launch because we didn't think about having that syringe. So that is just an example of that. That filled syringe seems so easy, and a customer, of course, would want it, but there's so much on the downstream side to that will have an impact on how you're going to bring to market.
So thanks, Jen. I think that's really, really critical. A few things that I've identified as some benefits. Early collaboration with regulators, in my view, is really quite important. Now, that's not necessarily in every case, but I would say in many, many cases, early collaboration with governing regulatory bodies has value. That could be in a variety of situations. So a request for designation, if there's some unclarity on what kind of product that you have in Q-sub or pre-sub meetings, for example, type A, B, C, or D, or interact meetings that could be offered by the regulators. My general experience in this particular area indicates that more times than not, there is great clarity that comes from those sorts of sessions. And having an early engaged cross-functional team really augments or accentuates your ability to be successful in those kinds of situations. It also helps broader understanding of classification rules. I don't know about most of you, but I've been in situations, especially with in vitro diagnostics, where it's not absolutely clear where that IVD might sit within the classification categories. In fact, it might sit in a couple of different areas and be very viable. However, the requirements might be a little bit different. The types of submissions might be different. The sorts of test data might be different. So having some good cross-functional clarity regarding classification and applicable guidance documents is very important, in my opinion, to have with your cross-functional team. Also, I think it helps to bring strategic clarity forward, where there might be some questions or some variables that exist. As I was alluding to earlier, if strategies need to be modified or refined, you can do that more appropriately on the fly when you're gathering and gaining information as compared out of sight, out of mind, and then trying to do that at the end. That normally is problematic, and it can be very challenging for the business. So as Jen mentioned, this whole concept of powers of the peripherals, or the larger or interacting team, is very important, at least from my perspective, from a regulatory perspective. And one of the things I just kind of wanted to comment on here as well. I would encourage all of us, myself included, when one has a really great cross-functional team, make sure that your regulatory representative clearly explains just not what can't be done. I think most people can do that, but also what can be done, and what sorts of avenues and viable options that one really has. That is a very essential difference. How does all of that come together? There's a lot of things that we talked about today. How does it come together? One of the ways in which the links of the chain remain viable and intact is through really great quality management systems. I know for a lot of smaller entrepreneurial organizations, this can really be a challenge. The best organizations that I have been with have always been strong with their quality management system. Anywhere from their management reviews all the way down to product release decisions. And when you have a well-oiled or organized cross-functional team, they not only exist through launch of the product, but through the entire product life cycle. So if you ever have a question about a technology that was developed with the design, for example, you know who the owner is. If you ever have an issue or a concern about how a product was released or the decision associated with that determination, you have a responsible party. If there is ever a question about the regulatory boundary that was established within the regulatory filings, you have an owner and a responsible party for that area. And those team members collaborate consistently all the way through sunsetting of the life of that particular product. The organizations which, again, at least in my experience, have worked seamlessly and the best have always been really strong in that area, working continually on continuous improvement. There are many industries that are out there that operate under quality management system umbrellas or parameters. Not only healthcare products or medical devices or the drug area of industry, but also the military, aeronautics, automotive, banking, microprocessors. Some of the most sophisticated processing that occurs in microchip and microprocessor manufacturing plants. It's really quite incredible. And so quality management systems go across a broad range of areas. A couple of examples that I had looked at about 2 years ago. I just wanted to share some concepts and some information with you. Within your functioning teams, whatever the size of your organization is, one encouragement that I would offer, make sure that your quality and that your regulatory representatives are watching carefully of what's happening in the market, and that they are carefully monitoring or watching what's going on with competition. I'm a big believer of you don't have to experience everything in life yourself to learn. You can learn a lot through careful observation. And when one keeps their finger on the pulse of what's going on out in industry, some very valuable lessons can be revealed. In this particular example, this was a warning letter that was issued to a microbial lab testing entity. If you look at the red that is noted on that particular slide, I think there are about 10 consistent notations of failure, 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 and failure. So as regulators came in and took a look at the operations of this particular entity, it wasn't just one or two things. There was a consistent pattern that was observed throughout the operation as long as the assessment went on. That, I think, is quite revealing. Another example is a medical device company with very similar kinds of findings. So not only were products found to be adulterated or violative in how they were either released, assembled, or put together, but there also was notable misbranding. But the main message here again is that there was a pattern of consistency that was observed as one took a look at what was going on within that operation. I find it interesting that there are many examples of some issues which we're probably pretty familiar with. Maybe some of you might remember that in 2018? In 2016, with Samsung phones, so their Galaxy Note 7 phones, there was some situations where those phones would just kind of burst in spontaneous combustion and they would kind of explode. And so someone started to record those, and those videos went viral. That ended up in a major reputational hit to Samsung. It was a year later, after they had made some software revisions and iterations, that then they had a replacement product, their Galaxy 8. A year later, it cost them a lot of money. There's another example with a Chinese company by the name of Sunroof. This I found was very interesting. There were deaths that were occurred in this particular situation. There was an additive that was applied to some of the formula or the milk that was manufactured by this group. I remember being in China on some business trips the time that this was announced. The Chinese government took this very, very seriously, and there was an investigation that occurred. There actually were a couple of, hard to believe this, but there were some executions that were performed as a result of this. I think there were 2 executions, and there were, 3 very difficult and challenging issues from a legal perspective that occurred, and significant fines. Even though some of these examples are extreme, this represents some of the challenges that could be faced when violative product is let out into the market. Another couple of examples with Merck and Pfizer, those are very well-known names, leading companies within our healthcare industry. The first one caught my attention because it dealt with Vioxx. I told Jen last night when we were having dinner, I took Vioxx. I was prescribed that drug. Now, I didn't take it, fortunately, I didn't take it as religiously or regularly as I should have, but that drug was eventually recalled. And it cost a couple of billions of dollars for Merck to get out of that situation. Another one was with Pfizer, with Dextra. That was a similar product right about the same time that Vioxx was out in the market. Some challenges occurred from a cardiovascular perspective, and that drug needed to be recalled, and it was at significant cost. Another couple of examples, whether it be with Firestone, whether it be with baby powder, with Johnson & Johnson, we're all familiar with these sorts of situations. Maybe one of the more prominent is with Boeing. Boeing is one of the great companies of American industry. It had built a reputation for decades and decades of being really the very best. I think we're all familiar with some of the 737 situations that have occurred and presented themselves. I'm not mentioning here, they had some challenges with some door bolts as well, as I recall. This led to notable fines. It represented significant loss of business, aircraft cancellations, flight groundings. Boeing really, unfortunately, had some reputational hits as a result of some of the experiences. And when investigations were performed, it was found that shortcuts were made within their operational systems. And that was just really unfortunate. One of the last slides that I just kind of wanted to go over here, and I don't want to end or conclude on a sour note, but some of the 10 largest medical recalls, if you look at some of the companies on the right side of that slide, household names. So irrespective of who you are as a company and what your reputation is, you always have to be vigilant of, and carefully examining what it is, what your output is, and how your teams are interacting and dealing with and addressing issues. Medtronic was involved in a pretty large recall of almost 160,000 units, all the way going down to West Pharma, where 39 million units had to be recalled. So some of these kinds of issues, depending on the severity and the level of risk presented, can really have a major impact. And not only do they have major impact, they can be a significant cost and really create some challenging situations out in the marketplace and with customers. So vigilance in these areas, in utilizing your quality management system and how you apply it, how you maintain it, and how it is implemented is very, very important, as well as the understanding of that system amongst your key experts on your, not only in your business, but on your team.
So we wanted to end with just a few examples of where we know where it's worked well. The upper left corner is Edward Sapien, and I don't know if you're familiar with this device. It's actually a aortic valve that's replaced through the femoral artery. It completely changed the marketplace with not having to have open chest surgeries. That was done through very high quality and regulatory upfront, because in order to bring it to the market, it was so revolutionary. They had to have a registry, and it had to be with very targeted. The FDA and the CE came back and said you could only do this in really little people. So like the first like couple hundred patients in Europe and the US were 90 and older, because they were just, it was the way, and the registry was there. So that registry was part of their launch, and that was what was monitored by legal and regulatory and quality for them to get that expanded indication. And now it's used in everyone and every place around the world. Of course, we know all about the post-it. If you don't know about post-it, I can tell you about that at Wiseacre later. But the post-it note is a great example of not only line extension and getting feedback from an ideation standpoint, but also the way it was discovered was pretty interesting, and how they brought it to market in a real cross-functional perspective. Then the bottom are products from 3M, which is the dental product. If you actually look at the yellow one, I was part of that new product development where the customers really wanted to stop, the dentists wanted to stop doing hand mixing on their little tablets before they put a crown in your mouth. If you've ever had a crown, it's probably be held there with a 3M SB cement, or hopefully. And what we had to do is what we were doing when we were doing voice of customer is how do we find a device. And when I was actually working with my manufacturing R&D engineers, that would do an auto mix. And then it would have the same consistency. So my engineers from mechanical engineer were finding us the device that would auto mix it. My lab engineers were giving us to make sure that the mix and the data was going to be able to do the claims that we wanted, that regulatory needed to submit to the FDA. And I was just telling them what the customer wanted. And they would say, well, we can't. I'd be like, well, we went to that focus group and we have this, we can show you the data that says voice of customer, that this is what we have to do and how do we create it. And then that kit has like 100 different languages on it, because we sent them around the world. And so then we had to have our manufacturing team make sure that those little syringes wouldn't get clogged, because it's cement. So how do you make sure that it doesn't clog? And it's one-time use. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And if we had just come at the end of the phase and said, I just want this, then it would have been disastrous, or at least not as much fun. And then the far right is a lot of those CR bars. So the power pick and the power port are the purple devices. If you've hopefully never had any family members or yourself have these devices, it just means you're really super sick. And so those are devices that actually can take and endure the CT scan, CT contrast. And so most of the picks or ports don't receive injections at a rate for contrast. It just comes in too fast and too thick. And the whole intention is that you'd have to do it through an IV instead of using your pick or your port. The port is triangular because we had to make sure from a regulatory standpoint that you would be able to identify through touch, because ports are placed in your like pacemaker under your skin. So it had to actually be through touch that a nurse, an oncology nurse, would know that it was a power port versus a regular port, and was able to receive that power injection. And so that triangular piece, working with regulatory, working with quality, as well as with the FDA, was able to be sufficient enough for the FDA to give the power injection indication that we needed in order for us to differentiate in the marketplace from a customer standpoint. Same thing with the purple picks. That's why they're purple and not white or gray. And it's actually trademarked. No one have power purple pick, except for now it's BD Medical. It's not affecting the Insulin Bot CR bar a while ago.
several years ago.
But that purple color is trademarked into the CR bar or BD Dickinson because it's a color differentiation so that when you see purple, you have to then work with your clinical affairs and your sales teams because that goes into training. And you have to meet those training expectations so that it meets the FDA based on regulatory requirements.
And one other, minor sidebar to what Jen is describing. One of the benefits that we utilized in this particular situation of her description of power cords was looking at a product family approach, or what's referred to as a representative type. And so we would establish a min and a max. So best case, worst case type of scenario. And if something was occurring within the middle, so some line extensions or products within a product family boundary, we didn't necessarily have to go through the official regulatory process finding it again with every new iteration because we had circumscribed that boundary nicely for the Food and Drug Administration. And so that enabled us to move to market a little bit faster in some situations of designs that might be in the middle of the range because the regulatory boundary had been established. The benefits that we were able to work through that really had some advantages for the company and the organization at that time.
And then the last one is called Sherlock, and this is a really old version of it, but it's a tip confirmation system. When you put in a pick, you have to, if it's done bedside, it used to be you have to go down the IR suite to get it confirmed before you could use it. And our strategy was how do you change the baseless competition of the pick placement? That was our goal. And so our R&D team found this technology. We were part of the new product development process where we had our cross-functional team watching nurses pick up the device. The reason why it's in that device shape is because we had literally 10 pieces of cardboard and I laid on the table. They would pick up the device that was most interesting to them and place it on my chest. And then we picked that shape. And so that was because it was just unaided. Pick the device, put it on, and then we asked them why, and they gave us the reasoning. And so now when you see, I think they're in version 3, but it's really, it all came from this concept of doing a cross-functional product development on how you're doing observational research, but at the same time, understanding what your strategic goal was. Our strategic goal was to replace the IR confirmation and really change the standard of care for patients, because when you're getting a pick, you're super sick. And you want to have that drug administered right away, and having to go from your bed down to the IR suite to get it confirmed was really take forever. And it was also really delaying care for the patients, which is the end goal at the end of the day. It's about patient care and how can our new products and technologies really accelerate patient care and doing it from, I put the iPod on there because everybody knows we don't have an iPod anymore, but that was also product extension. But it's just more of how do you obsolete the old so that you can always make what's needed for today and using that technology and having that end in mind of patient care there and treatment and making sure that cross-functional MPD process gets you there so that you can have the success that you see on the screen or on screen. And on that note, if you have any comments, thoughts, questions, we would love to entertain and have a conversation.
One thing I just wanted to say before we get to that, I think that all of you, if you're in the industry or in the discipline, you're working in a great area. There's a lot of value and benefit that comes in trying to improve patient lives, especially, situations are very dire. I know at St. Jude, for example, we deal with catastrophic pediatric diseases and rare, ultra rare kinds of situations that can be really challenging. But yet the organization, I'm sure your organization, wherever you are, or whomever you represent, whatever your team involvement is, that you're committed to that same thing. And it's really a laudable profession, and it can be great reward, but there also can be some risk as well, and you have to be balanced and really aware of both of those sides. So it's a great place, I think, where you're all dedicated to. Questions?
You don't have to.
Happy to.
We have that came through online. I'll start with that while you guys think of a question or two. So it kind of came in the middle of the talk, but you mentioned early on kind of, and actually later at the end, recalls. And the question is, from an investment standpoint, how does product recall affect regulatory standards, particularly in other countries?
Depending on where one is marketing your product, can have a major impact on how broad or how confined a recall might be. I will give an example of a real world situation that we were involved in where there were some reports that had come to us with medical lasers that we had sold within Japan. Japan was the only area in which these events were reported. And we did an investigation, and what we found through that investigation was some of the training that was provided probably was not the level that it should have been. MHLW shared that information with the Food and Drug Administration, and we also reported it to FDA. One day, we get a call from the Food and Drug Administration, and it says, we need to have a conversation. We've got a few reports here that have occurred in Japan. We need to review that with you. And the sum and substance of that conversation was, we have some concerns. We think that there ought to be a U.S. domestic recall as well. Even though there were no reports, there were no safety instances or any of those sorts of things. As I mentioned in part of the dialogue, when one shares information amongst the regulators, sometimes the regulators can have some real concerns about safety of a given product or a given situation, and they may require some recall activity. So when one is faced with a recall, make sure that your cross-functional operating teams, from a design perspective, from a quality perspective, from a clinical and a medical perspective, that they're really clear on the situation and what potential ramifications can occur, and also carefully check marketing claims and what you were stating about your product, so you've got a really great understanding of what the latitudes may be within a given recall situation. Again, my experience is, if you're certainly marketing product on an international perspective or basis, you probably are going to have to look at some pretty broad potential recall activities.
And then I'll add to that too, because one, I guess fortunately experienced this as well. But one of the things that was really interesting that we had to do was when we recalled our product, we had to work with our sales team to understand what was a substitute. And so, because we were doing heart surgeries, and open heart surgeries can't stop because we have manufacturing issues. So we actually worked with not only what product could be substituted, but the group that was our competitors, we all worked together, and we were able to say, for example, one of our competitors got shut down, and so they sent us their volume, and we then were able to work with ours just to ensure that the heart surgeries didn't stop. And so we were collaborating with our competitors, but we were collaborating with competitors, making sure we were getting product out there, and at the same time working with our sales teams to making sure they knew what was an alternative. So it's not just the meeting the expectations of the federal, and the governing bodies, but also making sure that there's not a stop in patient care.
And I would also say, to sort of conclude on that topic, I think being proactive and active and aggressive in your recall approach and your strategy and your direction is very, very important. Don't be shy if you have a situation like that to be the aggressor in dealing and interfacing with FDA. Have a well-contrived plan, know where products have been, and be aggressive in your approach to remediate, resolve, and address. I think normally that is almost always going to work to your advantage.
We've got another from an online attendee. It's a little more specific. So can you tell if respiratory products such as dry powder inhalers have any special regulatory consideration? They're a medtech founder working on an inhaler and looking to partner with pharma and drug makers to go through the approval process.
Well, I don't know that I can comment specifically on that. I think it's an interesting question. But certainly, what I would recommend or advise, based upon the particular situation, really take a very careful look at classification schemes and rules. Make sure that you understand guidance documents really very, very well. And if there are any kind of medical or clinical implications, that those have been carefully captured and contemplated within your risk assessment for a given product, and make sure that those are reviewed and really well understood. And then that will also, I think, kind of help drive what kind of remedial or remediation activity may need to happen in a given particular situation. I can't speak specifically about the product.
But I will add, I know I'm marketing, so how I know anything, but it also really is where they want to launch. So if they're looking in just the US, that's one thing, but it's not just, you can't say North America because Canada has different regulations. So having that strategy of, and then also in their development phase of understanding, making sure that where they're launching is also being represented in their testing.
Can I see a hand here?
Okay. Thanks. Thank you for this. Your cross-functional team is 100% well taken, and I think very important for anyone from smaller startup up through the highest and the biggest need to understand it. One thing I've noticed is there's a translational problem sometimes between different groups. What a scientist will say is X, Y, or Z is not what regulatory would say. X, Y, or Z, much less what a marketing plan would say. How do you guys think about that in terms of having who's the translator in the room? Who does the lexicon, who monitors that sort of thing?
So really interesting question, Chris. And I would say there are probably three entities that generally should be at the table. Certainly marketing or the customer representative, because they own the responsibility of the interpretation with what your customers or your clients are thinking. I think your regulatory entity or representative needs to be at the table. And I would also say your clinical and your medical expertise as well, because a lot of times medical and clinical clarification can help drive what would truly be legitimate to say or to not say, and what kind of claims might be expressed. And so I think the point that you're making is well taken. You just don't want one entity saying, I've got that, this is the way it's going to be. You need to have good cross-functional collaboration, because the implications of that decision can have many tentacles. And so you want to be coordinated and concentrated on what the right approach and the right response is.
Yeah, when we did our NPDs, we had RACEs. We would do RACEs on it, and it was always it was the marketer, just because the marketer was that translator. And so the marketer would be the one who was working, the MPD marketer was working with the clinical side, so what we're saying, and the regulatory side, so that when it went into the regulatory submission, that it was exactly the way we were going to be able to say it. Because one thing that why I like working with Rick, because he would always say, what can we say? Well, not what can't we say? And having that mindset would allow us, I wouldn't say freedom or flexibility, but it allows the conversation to say, this is what we want to say. And this is the data that we have to, how can we say what we want to say? Does our data prove it? This is what will be relatable to the clinician or the end user. And so that's why the marketer was on the racy side of the R side.
It's really interesting. I never considered that way, but I get it because it drives the whole piece of it.
Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Maybe just one little comment there too is with products that companies would be marketing, I think it's carefully consider what the best practice is for claims, indication, and labeling control. If one has a class 3 product, there's generally a requirement of what's referred to as a claims matrix. And so it's very particular what one can say. Things have to be approved, that has to be related back specifically to the regulatory filing. That's not necessarily always the case as applied to a class 2 or a class 1 product, but it is a best practice so that there's good understanding and consistency and that you're not getting wires crossed in the process. I can say from unfortunate experience that sometimes, I've had some of those wires crossed, which can be really challenging to unwind.
And one thing that's cool about the claims matrix is that it really drives product development and R&D. Because what you're saying is you're giving them here's what I want to claim, where the data is it, and it has to be published either in-house or published. And then is it a nice to have or a must have? And so it helps you also with prioritization of resources. So if they're limited, you can then say, okay, we have to have these. These are table stakes. Or if we're really trying to shift the way the market thinks about this particular category, this is where we have to have these claims. But if they're just nice to have, then you can put them out later. And then that also leads to product development and product strategy. Because if you're bringing out new claims as products already in the market, it gives your field teams different ways to talk about the product as you expand. And that's sometimes people think, I mean, it's really easy, but Cheerios, right? Everyone had Cheerios when you were a kid, probably, and they're the yellow box, and everyone knows it. But then all of a sudden we have honey nut, and we have apple cinnamon, and we have everything else. Those might have been in the General Mills mindset that they're gonna have flavors and Cheerios from the get-go, but you didn't bring them all out at one time because it allowed you to get more shelf space. Same thing about toothpaste. I mean, holy cow, how many toothpaste do we really need to choose from in a grocery store or yogurt? But if you think about that mindset of as you start your new product development process and your pipeline strategy, you can start to map out your impact, and then you're always part of the conversation. You're always being relevant to your end user, even though you might have had them in the bag the whole time. You just you're trying to figure out when you can bring them out.
So as you map out your process and thinking about really being involved in a smaller company that is going through the development process, how would you integrate, say, working with contract manufacturing or contract development organizations in relation to your matrix that you put up?
Great question, and certainly I don't think that it really matters a lot if it's internal or it's external. The types of approach or the quality levels of concern or requirement are generally, going to be very close to the same, if not consistent. If one is looking at a contract manufacturing organization, my advice is carefully look at their history, their ability, their capability, and their commitment to the kinds of quality standards which you may have within your organization or that you demand or that you set up for yourself. I wouldn't certainly think that that is a point of compromise. In fact, I think it's probably the other direction. Make sure that your entity really is a good reflection of who you are and who you want to be and what you want your products and your patient impact to be.
Yeah, I've worked in large orthopedics, also startups, watched my wife in create a med device startup. I think, we talk about cross-functional teams and we think about all the resources that a large organization can bring to bear, but also when I look at, being in the startup phase, I think it's very important that we don't underestimate finding the right regulatory partners very early on. I think a lot of small med device startups don't understand the difference in med device marketing and traditional marketing, and because you don't always have these people internal to the startup, right? Finding good partners that can help you understand the process, the requirements very early on, because to your point, even in the large companies, I've seen us go from bringing people in late to bringing them in earlier. And that's all because, 80% of the value and cost is locked in at the beginning of, an application and feasibility. So getting those people involved early, I think, and trusting them. I think the contract manufacturing, a lot of people are relying on them to have the quality systems in place to be able to carry some of that burden. So, you know, those are two big areas that I think a lot of people are outsourcing, and it's very important to do that early, and get and start that process and the relationship.
I've had the opportunity to be in consulting a couple times in my career. And one of the first times it's that mindset of a modular marketing consulting firm, just to your point, where our whole target audience for our consulting team was startups. And so we brought in that, we've been added market research into our portfolio. And so there are these little small, I don't like the word boutique because we weren't really boutique, but you know, there's these small consulting groups which are focused on manufacturing or quality or marketing that can serve that. And it's like you said, we're not looking, I don't design websites, but I can tell you what I need on my website. And I'm not a graphic designer, my cousin is, you know, but it's that whole concept of making sure you're asking for the right things. Rick and I were on the startup and we were really working with a contract manufacturer. We wanted to make sure they had a QMS because we needed that QMS because we didn't have the capability because our startup was bare bones. And so we wanted to make sure that it had a QMS. We needed a QMS so that we could submit to the our 510(k) into the FDA.
And sometimes you also have to, you know, really try within your teams, develop the ability to look around corners and anticipate as much as possible. Not long ago, I was had an assignment within an organization that we were very convinced, we had convinced ourselves that this particular direction was absolutely right. We had gone out and we had hired some of the best law firms in Washington, D.C., a healthcare area. We had paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to get to a certain point. But when we approached the FDA, we really had a pretty rude awakening that that was not their view or their interpretation or the direction that they would allow us to go. And we really felt that we had done everything that we possibly could, with the exception of early engagement with them, being the FDA. We had shied away from that, which in retrospect was a major mistake. We never should have taken that approach because we would have learned earlier that maybe we need to have a slight course correction when we were flying from Gainesville, Florida, all the way to Seattle. And we found out that we weren't even close to Seattle. We were down in the San Francisco area somewhere because we had gone such a major distance and we were just a few degrees off. That was really hard for us as a business. So a couple of very interesting, you know, lessons learned from real life experiences.
All right, well, thank you. I'm really excited that we had such an engaging conversation there again. I know I still had a few questions, but in the interest of time, maybe we'll carry that over to the Beer and Biotech, but I appreciate everyone being here in person today and joining us virtually. You'll take a moment to join me in thanking Rick and Jen for those interested, again, please go online, contact us, register for LST next week. Please join us. It's going to be a really great event. And then for those that are here, we're going to be moving over to Wiseacre, which is just down the street. So please feel free to join us and continue the conversation there.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
It's easy. Still do it when I get to job. Still master.